August and September are hedge cutting time, and students have been busy cutting this laurel hedge. As you can see, they've done a nice job of cutting it with a hedge trimmer. Laurel is in the cherry family, so officially you have to be careful about pruning, and it doesn't like having harsh cuts or slices across the leaves. But with a hedge this size, it would be impossible to do it. Sorry, seagulls. Noisy seagulls. It would be impossible to do this with a secateurs slicing through. So you have to cut it with a hedge trimmer. But you can see they've done a fantastic job of cutting the laurel hedge nice and straight and square across the top. And over this side, lots of weeding and cutting back of grasses and tidying up of this space has been done also. Well done, guys, brilliant work. This hedge has gotten a much harder cutback this year than previous years, so we've gone almost to bare wood, taking off all the leaves this year. The way to correctly cut any hedge is, as previously mentioned in another video, to go on a slight angle either side. So the hedge should be wedge shaped, and the procedure for cutting a hedge is to cut all of the sides first of all, both sides first, and then to cut the top. And there's good reason for that. It means less time up on a ladder, if there is need for a ladder, and it's also, when you've cut both sides, the hedge is narrower, so it's much easier to kind of lean in across and cut the top of the hedge. So it means you're spending more time on the grounds and more times with your arms down lower rather than stretching up and over. And then the last thing to understand is that when you're cutting a hedge, because the branches grow on an upward or slanted trajectory this way, cutting upwards with the hedge trimmer moving like this is a better way to cut than going downwards. The reason why is because on the way down you might catch the branches and pull them down, and then you get kind of divots and different cuts out of it. So starting at the bottom and working your way upwards through the hedge is the correct way to cut a hedge. This bespoke horticultural sculpture is starting to colour up nicely. It's starting to rust in places, which gives a nice russety colour to all of the tools that we would use on a daily basis as part of a horticultural course. Trowels, old Dutch hoe. This was a pretty useless rake anyway, so that's why we got rid of that. And a shovel, and a funny looking spade really, but it's an old one. And a fork. So it was part of a new pathway and a new garden around to the horticultural classroom. And these slabs are 1970s, 1960s style heavy slabs, but we put a modern take on them by slicing them in three and turning them into planks. So that was a good way of using the concrete saw and getting experience using it. And we put them in a brickwork fashion here, and then we had a central area of the ordinary slabs and continued on again. It's a good way of getting paving experience. And then the pathway that it connected up with, this one here, an original pathway, is on an angle, so we had to pivot the slabs down, and it was a good way to show the students how to achieve that. This is a piece of outdoor photography by a really talented photographer, Vincent McMonigal. And we put it on a canvas, an outdoor canvas. It was used for Garden of Bloom a few years ago, and we decided to put it up here. So you've got a view of the upper lake at Glendalough, County Wicklow. We are sitting in the shade of a Portuguese laurel, a holly, and a very large western red cedar, and many other trees and shrubs. And this kind of environment is very difficult for plants underneath to grow in. So I thought we might look at some trees that will tolerate a shady, dry location. So you can imagine, if you look here at all of the trees and the ivy growing up them, that this environment is difficult because it is completely infiltrated with roots, all competing and looking for water. And there isn't much light available either. So some of the things that are doing well here are downright weeds, such as this winter heliotrope, which again can be nice. Sometimes there's a small little cyclamen is doing quite well here. And by walking around the shaded area, you can start to see the things that will do well. But this one here is probably the star of the show in very difficult locations. It's a plant called Butcher's Broom, Ruscus aculeatus, and it's an interesting plant for a few reasons, not least the fact that it's quite spiny and hard to touch. But one of the most interesting things is the fact that this what looks like a leaf is actually not a leaf at all. It's a modified stem, and believe it or not, this little tiny dot in the center is actually the leaf. So it has modified itself in such a way that the stem has lots of chlorophyll in it, and it is easier for the stem to capture as much light as possible if it has the shape of a leaf. So that's interesting in itself. But something that would be more interesting in the shade, because of the fact that it has a little bit more colour in it and more interest, is a plant like this. And this is Aucuba japonica Crotonifolia, and it has these nice little variegation splashes or speckles. It's known as speckled laurel. And this one's here a couple of years now, and it's just starting to take a proper foothold. It will get nice red berries, and I think we've got some other nice specimens of this plant around. But it will be happy in dry shade, which is the important thing. One more plant that seems to be happy in this dry shade is Fatsia japonica, and you'll all remember this from your plant identification or your houseplant identification as well, because of the fact that it is very suitable as a houseplant as well. So it's Fatsia japonica, or the False Castor Oil, and it's got these beautiful tropical architectural leaves. Something else with tropical architectural leaves is this Hellebore, Helleborus argutifolius, and in the spring it gets really lime green, nice. I suppose they're kind of leaf-like, or flowers that are full of chlorophyll, and this does really well in a shaded position too. And another plant that likes dry shade, this is Euphorbia mellifera, and it tolerates dry shade as well. A really good plant for dry shade, and it's got this lovely rounded shape which gives it a kind of a look of its close relation, which is Crotonifolia, and one of the varieties is Humpty Dumpty. And of course ivy, Hedera helix. You either love it or hate it. It will grow up these trees and has to be addressed every so often, because it will create a big ball of ivy up the top and compete with the tree for light, and also create wind resistance. But on the ground here, it creates a really good ground cover and stops other weeds coming up. So it can be quite a nice cover in dense shade. Yes, there are some tree seedlings coming up in this, but the ivy is definitely the dominant. And this here, not much more of the flowers on view, but earlier on in the year it would have arum leaves, which are a kind of a spear shaped leaf. This one is lords and ladies, and it's known as Arum Italicum. And this is a really nice arum lily. The berries are poisonous, but it has quite an attractive look at this time of the year popping up. And this area here in the spring has got some spring bulbs popping through the ivy, and does quite well. When you first plant a garden, there are very few areas of shade, but as the garden gets more mature and the trees and the shrubs get to a point where they are creating shade, they're blocking the sunshine from plants below, it becomes more important to find plants that will tolerate the environment below the trees. And here at Park House we have lots of places like that. As you can see, there are trees around that are creating shade, and in some of these shaded areas the grass will struggle to grow. In other areas there will be plants that will find it difficult underneath. So a good way of working out what is good for a shady spot is to go and visit a garden that has shaded areas. This is a plant that likes a certain amount of shade. It's a Skimia japonica, and creates quite nice berries, flowers followed by berries, and enjoys a dry shaded position. More of the Aucuba. This one doing particularly well. You can see there's no health problems whatsoever with this. And behind it here is a Prunus laurocerasus. We've been looking at that as a hedge, but it's also an excellent plant for dry shade. It will create a canopy for other plants underneath. This here, I think we looked at it earlier on in the year when it was in flower, but it is the dog's violet, Viola cornuta, so a relation of the pansy as well. And then this plant comes up everywhere as well. It's a Hypericum with nice blackberries. And this is an iris, I think it's Foetidissima, known as the stinking iris, but it has really attractive flowers followed by these seed heads which bust open and has orange berries within it as well. Quite a nice plant. Solomon seal loves shade and happy in a dry position too. Really attractive looking leaves along a stem, and white flowers in the spring followed by blackberries. It seems like the blackberries are gone from this one here, but they would have hung on these little stems. And quite a lot of ferns are good for dry shade. Some like some water, but a lot of them tolerate a very dry position, such as this one, which is a Dryopteris. And these ones, I'm going to have to put the name up on screen because I can't remember exactly what they are, but they're probably a type of a splenium. And this one, which I think is a Blechnum. They look great in the spring, in the early summer, when they come up with their new leaves. And what you need to do, because some of these are evergreen, is pull out some of the older leaves to show off the newer ones as they come up. Epimedium. This one is Sulphurium, and it has very nice autumn colour. It will just start to turn red later on now. In the spring it comes up with very kind of orangey leaves and has beautiful white flowers as well. And again, in this difficult situation, it seems to be happy in the dry shade. Crested fern. And Euphorbia Robbie. This was just planted last year and it will establish very well in dry shade. It does really well. And very attractive flowers in the spring. More lime green followed by a kind of an orangey yellowy colour. And in a large area like this it would be happy. In a small garden it can become a bit of a brute and a beast. And of course all sorts of crane's bills, the hardy geraniums. These guys really do well in dry shade. They're happiest in this kind of a situation. This plant is Bistort. It's a type of Persicaria polygonum, and they have attractive flowers now, and the leaves are quite good. You could probably argue that they probably look a little bit like a dock leaf, but they're a little bit more ornamental and a little bit more mannerly than dock leaves, and the leaves are a little bit more consistent and it grows in a clump. It's lovely sunshine today. We've been waiting a while for days like this. And some of the fuchsias, believe it or not, actually like shade. They like hedgerow as well. And the fuchsia Magellanica rickertonii, which this one isn't, this is probably more like a Tom Thumb or a Mrs. Popple. They are happy to grow in a hedgerow and be below other trees such as this holly, and holly of course grows well in shade. It eventually becomes part of the canopy, but in the meantime it's quite happy to be in shade and wait for a gap in the canopy to shoot up slowly enough into to take up that space. This plant is Desfontainea spinosa. It looks a little bit like holly, but gets these really cool orange flowers on it. And it's not something I would have associated with dense shade, but it's certainly competing here quite happily in the shade alongside this phlox, which again likes a dry position. The only thing is sometimes in a dry position it can get powdery mildew. And this prostrate or horizontal yew will definitely tolerate any position you give to it. It will grow anywhere. Very, very hardy, very strong, very tough plant. And behind it, another tough Aucuba japonica, as we saw it before, the speckled laurel. Any member of the box family, Buxus sempervirens, or this one which is Buxus buxifolia, will tolerate a shady position. They are very hardy plants, will grow underneath trees. They might have a few less leaves, they might be looking like they're suffering a small bit, but they seem to get over that fine, and eventually they can be quite happy in dry shade. This is a Viburnum carlesii, very fragrant in the spring, and it's not totally covered by trees, but it certainly does get shade for a lot of the day, and it's a good plant for shade, as is this Mahonia charity, and there was another one back a little bit further which was Mahonia aquifolium. And Mahonias in general are quite good for shade and quite good for dry conditions. This is a good ivy. It's facing northwest, so it doesn't get a lot of light, but you can see it's still showing its variegation really well. It's a variety known as Paddy's Pride, Hedera colchica Paddy's Pride, and it's very happy on this wall. The same as the hydrangea petiolaris, which is a climbing hydrangea, and it's always recommended for a north facing wall, and as you can see it has flowered this year earlier on in the season on a north facing wall. And here's another one of the Skimmia japonica, the same as this one, and they like the shade. Holly, as we mentioned, liking the shade here, and proving the point I made earlier, Buxus buxifolia underneath a dogwood, Cornus capitata, and it's quite happy there. And this is one of those stinking iris flowers, really attractive, followed on by the seed head, which busts open into orange berries, as I was mentioning. And some more Hellebores here in the shade, as you can see. Doing really well and happy. Getting a chink of light at the moment, but in about a half an hour there will be no more light for them for the rest of the day. And they seem to be happy with that. They'll flower really well in the spring. Here, the seed head of the stinking iris is just busting open, and as you can see, it has really cool orange berries. Great plant for shade. This one is in the sunshine and it'll tolerate that too, but they are a good plant for shade. As is the Virginia, all of the varieties of Virginia cordifolia. A lot of these plants that I've been showing you would be worth seeing again in the spring, because they a lot of them tend to be spring flowering. Lots of the anemone japonica, which can get quite messy at this time of year, but they have flowered for quite a number of months now. They tolerate a shady position, and they are really, really tough and hardy, really good for shade. Laurel, Prunus laurocerasus used here, and we're cutting into a kind of flat table below these Portuguese laurel lollipops, and it's a nice effect, but they are below these huge black pines, and they're really happy in this shady position. And this is Fuchsia Ricartonii that I mentioned before, in a dappled shade. Gets some sunshine here, blocked a little bit by the building and overshadowed by a canopy of black pine, the same as the others. And in here is more of this butcher's broom, as we mentioned. And at this time of year, the new foliage of the Acanthus mollis, which is known as Bears Breeches, it has finished flowering and can look quite sick sometimes here, because the older leaves tend to get powdery mildew. But the new leaves, and these guys will actually continue right into the winter. The lovely lush green leaves of Acanthus mollis are very happy in a dry position, in a dappled shade. More of the stinking Hellebore, and this is a really difficult position, because you can imagine that these trees are really taking a lot of the moisture out of the ground here. And the yew tree seems to be happy underneath the pines, again because it's a very tough tree, and will probably, left to its own devices, live a lot longer than the pine trees. These trees can live for a couple of thousand years if given the right conditions.